Welcome to our deep dive into the Black Panther Party. I've got to say, the sources you sent over for this one, really fascinating stuff. We've got excerpts from Black Against Empire, some firsthand accounts, and even a peek into their activities abroad. It's going to be a wild ride uncovering some unexpected alliances, busting some myths, and hopefully walking away with a whole new understanding of this iconic organization.
Yeah, it really is amazing to trace their journey, from their beginnings in Oakland all the way to their global impact. And along the way, we'll be looking at how all of their actions, from the armed patrols to those free breakfast programs, how that all connected with huge historical moments like the Vietnam War and the rise of Black Power.
Okay, so let's get into it. To really grasp the Black Panthers, we can't just skim the surface. We got to go deeper, right into the streets of Oakland where it all started. And the sources we have, they really paint a vivid picture of what life was like for Black communities back then.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that the Black Panther Party, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was a direct response to some really specific conditions: systemic racism, police brutality, poverty. And the Watts Rebellion, just a year before the Panthers formed, that was like a raw explosion of all that frustration.
Right, and it wasn't just major events like Watts. Black Against Empire, it zooms in on the founders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and their world. It even mentions how Newton's brothers, each of them dealt with Oakland's realities in completely different ways. One turned to hustling, another joined the military, and the third went the academic route.
What's so fascinating about that detail is it kind of foreshadows the diversity, even within the Black Panther Party itself. The different approaches to achieving Black liberation. It wasn't just one monolithic group. You had individuals with different experiences all coming together.
So you've got this pressure cooker of social tension, right? And just before the Panthers emerge, there's this group, the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, active in Oakland. What's their connection to this whole story?
RAM is crucial because they provide this direct ideological link, especially in those early years, to the Black Panther Party. They emphasize connecting the struggles of Black Americans to global anti-imperialist movements. They saw Black communities as internal colonies within the U.S., and they drew these parallels to the struggles against colonialism happening all over the world.
Oh, so they were talking about, like, overthrowing the U.S. government. That's pretty radical.
Well, they were definitely advocating for radical change, but it wasn't just about armed struggle. They focused on political education, community organizing, and building international solidarity as well. They were deeply involved in those protests against the Vietnam War, and they criticized the fact that a disproportionate number of Black men were being drafted to fight.
Right, okay. That anti-war, anti-draft stance totally makes sense with everything that was happening back then. And that theme of challenging authority, especially the police, that becomes central to the Black Panthers. But before we get into those famous patrols, how did RAM actually influence the Panthers' early strategy?
One of the things that RAM solidified was this idea of armed self-defense. They believed it was absolutely essential for Black liberation. And they got this idea from their connection to Robert F. Williams, who, by the way, many consider to be a pretty controversial figure. But the idea wasn't about starting violence. It was about protecting Black communities, especially from, racist attacks and police brutality.
Gotcha. And that's where those, like, iconic Black Panther patrols come into play, right? Armed Panthers patrolling the streets of Oakland, watching the police. They were definitely making a statement, but it was also
Surprisingly legal. It's really important to remember that California at that time had open carry laws that allowed for this. And the Panthers, they were strategic about it. They knew the law. They made sure their patrols were by the book. It wasn't some reckless provocation. It was a calculated challenge to police authority and a way to hopefully prevent brutality.
And those patrols, they got a lot of attention, right? I mean, our sources talk about the police rallies that the Panthers organized. They would, like, monitor arrests and directly stand up to any police harassment. Must have been quite the scene.
They were absolutely galvanizing for the community. They showed people, that someone was willing to stand up to the power structure and protect their own. And it really resonated. There's one incredible story about a rally where people from the community, just regular folks, showed up with their own guns because they were so inspired by the Panthers. Talk about a turning point. It really showed how much the community was ready to take their safety into their own hands.
Whoa, picture that. Everyday people, inspired by the Panthers facing off against the police. That must have been electric. So we've got armed patrols, rallies, directly challenging the police. This is the Black Panthers' initial approach. But then things shifted. Right, a major
Yeah.
turning point comes with
The
it.
Mulford Act of 1967.
Right, the Mulford Act.
This law, they pushed it through the California legislature, and it outlawed the open carry of loaded firearms. And Black Against Empire makes this really compelling argument that while the law on the surface was about public safety, it was very clearly targeting the Panthers, aiming to disarm them, to stop those patrols.
So this law, meant to shut them down, actually pushed them in a whole other direction.
Exactly. They couldn't rely on the patrols anymore, so they adapted. And this is where Huey P. Newton, his political writings, and the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, this is where they come into focus.
Right, okay, the 10-point program. This is their, like, manifesto, right? It lays out their demands for everything, decent housing, ending police brutality, all of it.
It was incredibly comprehensive and, honestly, for its time, really radical. They demanded full employment, decent housing, an end to police brutality. But it went deeper than that. They also demanded Black control of education, exemption from military service, and even the release of Black prisoners who they considered political prisoners. And what's interesting here is that Black Against Empire highlights how the Black Panther newspaper, they started publishing essays by Newton, and he's weaving together ideas from all these different thinkers like Malcolm X, Mao Zedong, and Frantz Fanon to really solidify this new approach. It's like they were taking their local struggles and connecting them to this global anti-colonial movement. They were developing a much more sophisticated political analysis.
So it wasn't just about the guns anymore. They were becoming this political and intellectual force. And with this evolution, they also started interacting more with other Black power organizations and those big civil rights leaders. But those relationships weren't always easy, were they?
Not at all. There were times of collaboration, moments of unity, for sure, but there were also disagreements, even rivalries. The Panthers saw themselves as kind of a vanguard, advocating for more radical change than some other groups were comfortable with, and they weren't afraid to say so.
Yeah, and you can see that in our sources, some of those tensions come through.
Yeah.
The one that really sticks out to me is Eldridge Cleaver's critique of white radicals in the Panther newspaper. He was really questioning their role, the role of white allies, and he really emphasized Black self-determination.
That was a defining moment for the Black Panthers. It wasn't that they were rejecting allyship completely, but they were making it very clear that Black people needed to be leading their own liberation. They were challenging the traditional power dynamics, the ones that existed even within these movements for social change.
That's such a critical point, this insistence on Black leadership, on control over their own destiny. But even with these internal tensions, the Panthers were becoming nationally known, right? And what really catapulted them onto the national stage was,
The arrest of Huey Newton.
okay, yeah, this is where things get really interesting. You've got this charismatic leader, he's already a symbol of defiance, and now he's facing serious charges for killing a police officer. And the Free Huey campaign that comes after, well, it wasn't just about Huey anymore, was it?
Absolutely not. That campaign, it transformed the Black Panther Party. They went from being this local Oakland organization to a national movement. People were connecting with their message, those calls for justice, for an end to police brutality. It was capturing the attention of the entire country.
It's wild how one event could cause such a ripple effect. And it wasn't just Black communities who were responding, right? Our sources point to this convergence of movements happening at the time, especially the anti-war movement. There were growing alliances between Black and white activists.
Yeah, the Free Huey campaign, it became this rallying cry for a whole range of issues, not just police brutality and racial injustice, but also the Vietnam War and the draft. It really shows how movements that might seem separate can find common ground and build solidarity.
It's remarkable, how a movement rooted in these local issues in Oakland could have such a massive impact. But of course, the story doesn't end there. The Black Panthers weren't content with just national recognition. They were looking beyond America's borders.
Exactly. Their international connections, they become even more fascinating, and we'll get into that next, especially their, rather surprising trip to China. So you mentioned that trip to China, and that's where we really start to see the Black Panther Party's global reach expanding.
Okay, help me out here. The Black Panthers, calling for revolution in the U.S., are being welcomed in communist China. I mean, what was the deal with that?
Well, you got to remember, this was the peak of the Cold War, right? And both China and the Black Panther Party saw themselves as challenging American power, although in very different ways. For the Panthers, it was about exposing, America's hypocrisy when it came to racial equality. They were calling for self-determination for Black communities.
And China was pushing back against American influence globally?
Exactly. So they kind of found this common ground in being anti-establishment, you could say.
Right, right.
And the sources describe the Panthers being treated like honored guests in China. They met with Premier Zhu Enlai, even got to visit factories and communes. Think about that image. Black Panther leaders standing in Tiananmen Square, celebrated by the Chinese government. While back in America, they were being painted as this dangerous threat to national security.
Whoa. Yeah, that's a powerful contrast.
hmm
It really highlights those contradictions in how America was seen on the world stage.
It definitely does. And it wasn't just China either. The Panthers are making connections all over the world.
Right, they had chapters in all these different cities across the U.S.
And they were connecting with groups in Algeria, North Korea, Vietnam. They even had an embassy in Algeria.
An embassy. That's a whole other level. It sounds like they were being recognized as a legitimate political force globally.
Oh, they absolutely were. And that was all part of their strategy. They were leveraging these international connections to put pressure on the U.S. government, to expose those hypocrisies we talked about,
Yeah.
and to gain legitimacy for their cause.
Okay, so they're challenging the government, they're building global connections, but then they're also doing something that seems, well, kind of contradictory at first.
Hmm.
They're running these community programs.
Right.
It feels like revolution and serving breakfast. Those two things don't exactly go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding about the Black Panther Party. Their community programs, they weren't just acts of charity. They were deeply connected to their revolutionary ideology. They believed that empowering their communities, meeting those basic needs, was all part of building self-reliance, demonstrating that a different kind of society was possible.
It wasn't just about feeding hungry kids.
No, it was much bigger than that. Take the Free Breakfast for Children program. It started in Oakland, but it spread nationwide so quickly. It was about addressing a real need, of course, but it was also about empowering the community, showing them that they didn't have to wait for the government to take care of them, you know? They could take control, create solutions themselves.
It's amazing how they managed to do all of this while constantly being watched by law enforcement.
Mm.
And of course, we can't talk about the Black Panther Party without talking about COINTELPRO, the FBI's program.
Right.
This was a deliberate campaign to undermine and discredit them.
COINTELPRO was absolutely devastating for the Black Panther Party. The FBI used every dirty trick they could think of, planting false information, stirring up violence, creating divisions within the party itself. They saw the Black Panthers as a huge threat, and they were determined to take them down.
And one of the most tragic consequences of that was the assassination of Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party,
Right.
killed in a police raid on his apartment in Chicago.
Hampton's death was a massive loss for the movement. He was an incredible organizer, charismatic leader, and he was able to build bridges between all these different groups. He formed the Rainbow Coalition, bringing together the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots, this multiracial alliance fighting for social justice.
Wow.
And the FBI, they saw him as extremely dangerous, and they were directly involved in his assassination.
It's chilling to think about how far the government was willing to go to silence dissent. And it wasn't just Hampton. So many other Black Panthers were killed, imprisoned, or forced into exile because of COINTELPRO and these other government actions.
The impact of that repression was huge. It created this atmosphere of paranoia and distrust within the party, drained their resources, made it incredibly difficult to function effectively.
So you have this incredibly complex organization. They're revolutionaries, they're community organizers, they're practically international diplomats, and they're under constant attack from the government. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is.
And one part of their story that often gets overlooked is the huge role that women played in the Black Panther Party. They weren't just in supporting roles. They were leaders, organizers, activists, intellectuals, essential to the party's success.
That's such a crucial point, and the sources we have, they definitely back that up. Can you talk a bit more about the roles women played and the challenges they faced within the movement?
Women were involved in every single aspect of the Black Panther Party, from the armed patrols to the community programs, all the way up to leadership. They were running the Free Breakfast for Children program, organizing rallies, writing for the newspaper. Figures like Kathleen Cleaver, Elaine Brown, Erica Huggins, they were incredibly influential.
And yet, they were operating within a movement that, at times, was pretty patriarchal.
Oh, absolutely.
There were definitely tensions between the party's rhetoric about Black masculinity and, the actual realities of women's experiences. For sure. There was sexism within the Black Panther Party, just like there was in society at large. Women had to fight to have their voices heard, their contributions recognized, their leadership acknowledged. They challenged the male dominance within the party and pushed for greater equality.
It reminds us that even within these movements for social justice, there are still struggles over power and representation.
Exactly. And the Black Panther Party's story is full of these complexities. It's a story of heroism and sacrifice, of brilliant ideas and strategic errors, of internal conflicts and external pressures.
It challenges our assumptions, makes us confront some uncomfortable truths.
It does, and it's a story that still resonates today.
Speaking of today, we've talked a lot about the Black Panther Party's history, but what about their legacy? What kind of impact do you think they've had on social movements today?
That's a great question, and I think their legacy is multifaceted. On one hand, they left behind this model of community organizing and empowerment that continues to inspire activists today. Their
Mhm.
community programs, their emphasis on self-reliance, their understanding of how different forms of oppression connect, these are all ideas that have been taken up by later generations of activists.
You can see echoes of the Black Panthers in movements like Black Lives Matter, right, that focus on challenging police brutality and systemic racism, the use of direct action and protest, the emphasis on Black self-determination.
Absolutely. And it's not just about tactics either. It's about a way of thinking about social change, understanding those root causes of injustice, and believing in the power of people to create a better world.
But their legacy is also complicated, isn't it? They were controversial, and that embrace of armed self-defense alienated some potential allies and contributed to them being demonized by the government and the media.
True. And it's important to grapple with that complexity, to acknowledge the mistakes they made, those internal conflicts, and the ways their tactics sometimes backfired. But we can do that without dismissing their contributions or minimizing the very real threats they faced.
It's about understanding their story in its full context, the good and the bad.
Exactly. And I think there are valuable lessons to learn from their
Mhm.
experience, lessons about community, the power of collective action, the need to challenge injustice in all its forms.
What stands out to you about their story? What do you think is the most important thing for people to remember about the Black Panther Party?
I think the most important thing is remembering that they were fighting for a more just and equitable world. They were fighting against racism, poverty, police brutality. They wanted a world where Black people could live with dignity and freedom. And that's a fight that continues today.
That's a powerful thought. It brings us back to that image of the Panthers, patrolling the streets of Oakland, challenging everything, demanding a better future.
They were a product of their time, for sure, a response to those very specific conditions of the 1960s. But their message, their vision, their willingness to fight for what they believed in, that goes beyond any particular era. That's something we can all learn from.
It's interesting when you see those early images of the Black Panthers, it's easy to get caught up in I don't know, the militant look, right? The
Right.
leather jackets, the berets, the guns.
Hmm.
But there was so much more to them than that.
Oh, absolutely. Those images, while they were powerful symbols of resistance, they often kind of overshadowed the deeper work they were doing, especially in their communities. Their community programs, those weren't just some side project, those were core to their mission.
We've touched on the Free Breakfast for Children program, but the scope of their work was really impressive. They had free health clinics, legal aid. They even provided transportation to prisons so families could visit loved ones. It was this whole holistic approach to meeting their community's needs.
And what's really striking about those programs is that it wasn't just about meeting immediate needs, it was about empowering people, about building self-sufficiency. The Black Panthers, they believed that by showing they could provide for their communities, they were exposing the failures of the government and offering this viable alternative.
It's almost like they were creating a parallel system, a model for what a more just and equitable society could look like. And they weren't afraid to challenge the status quo, even when it came to healthcare. I was reading about their health clinics, and they were providing services that were often denied to Black communities, like screenings for sickle cell anemia.
Exactly. They saw healthcare as a right, not a privilege, and they were determined to provide it to those who were being systematically denied access. Those clinics, they were more than just medical facilities, they were hubs for community organizing and political education.
They really saw those programs as completely intertwined with their political goals. Like, it wasn't just about charity, it was about revolutionizing how society functioned.
Exactly. And this approach, it came from their understanding of the Black experience in America. They saw how Black communities were systematically oppressed, not just by individual acts of racism, but by the very way society was structured.
And that brings us back to their 10-point program. which really laid out their vision for a more just society. It
Right.
wasn't just about ending police brutality. It was about economic justice, educational equality, a fundamental shift in power.
Right. Their demands were radical, but they were also grounded in the everyday realities of Black life in America. They were demanding things that, for most Americans, are just taken for granted: decent housing, quality education, access to healthcare.
It's fascinating how much their ideas still resonate today. You see movements like Black Lives Matter picking up that mantle, demanding an end to systemic racism, calling for a radical transformation of society.
The Black Panther's legacy, it's complex and multifaceted, but there's no doubt they had a huge impact on activists and organizers who came after them. That focus on self-determination, community empowerment, and challenging those systems of oppression, it continues to inspire those fighting for social justice today.
One thing that really struck me going through these sources is just how young so many of the Black Panther leaders were. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they were in their early 20s when they founded the party.
That's a really important point. The Black Panther Party was a youth-led movement, and their energy, their passion, their willingness to challenge the status quo, it all reflected that. They were impatient for change, and they weren't afraid to take risks.
And they weren't afraid to be bold, creative with their tactics. The way they use imagery, their uniforms, their slogans, it all added to their powerful presence and helped them get the world's attention.
They really understood the power of symbolism, of spectacle. They knew how to use the media to their advantage, even when the media was often against them.
It makes you think about how their legacy has been shaped by those images, both the empowering ones and the ones that were used to demonize them.
Absolutely. The Black Panther Party was a complex organization, often contradictory. They were revolutionaries, but they were also community builders. Confrontational, but also deeply committed to serving their people.
And their story reminds us that history is never simple. There are always nuances, complexities, and we have to be willing to engage with those complexities if we really want to understand the past and learn from it.
It's a challenge to us, to think critically about power, about what justice really means, and the role we can play in creating a more equitable world. It's a story that continues to spark debate, to inspire action, and it deserves to be told, retold in all its complexity.
Well said. I think for our listeners, diving deep into these sources, it's more than a history lesson. It's an invitation to keep asking questions, keep exploring the legacy of the Black Panther Party and what it means for the challenges we face today.
Exactly. The fight for social justice, it's ongoing. And the Black Panther Party's story offers these really valuable insights into the strategies, the challenges, and the possibilities of that struggle. Their legacy lives on in the countless activists and organizations that are still fighting for a more just and equitable world.
So as you continue to learn about this chapter in history, here's something to think about. What do you think is the most enduring legacy of the Black Panther Party? How do their ideas and actions continue to shape our world today? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into the world of ideas and history.